Greetings to all. Today we have the unique opportunity to speak with the JD Vance brother about the ongoing war and its implications. Ukraine is supported in its fight against the Russian Federation by JD Vance brother Nate. He was part of the Wolves of Da Vinci and was willing to risk his life to help Ukraine. Nate distinguished himself in the US Army and then decided to assist in Ukrainian struggle. Nate, glad to see you and thank you for joining us.
Nice to see you too.
Okay, Mr. Vance, about your brother, because yes, Vice President JD Vance did not talk publicly about your service in Ukraine because he didn't want to endanger his life more than it already was. He told Fox News on March 11th. JD Vance told Fox News, a quote, "As far as his criticisms, I have no interest in arguing with him in public, but I do feel the need to address one issue in particular. He's failed effort to contact me. I'm unsure why Nate felt the need to reach out to my Senate office rather than to his mom, dad or sister, all of whom I am in contact with regularly. I understand that it can be challenging to reach someone through official channels. Have you tried other methods of contacting JD Vance, perhaps through social media or direct message or something else?"
Well, since that broadcast, I've actually had lunch with my cousin in the White House. So about a week or so ago, I sat down with him for about 2.5 hours in the White House and had lunch. And, obviously it's not a public meeting. I was meeting him in private. There is an expectation of privacy there, so I'm not going to discuss in detail the things that we talked about, but I can say that I left there more confident than I did when I entered. So yeah, I have been in touch with him.
So what would you say to your brother if you were face-to-face with him right now? If you had the chance to speak to your brother directly, what would be your first words?
How have you been? That, like I haven't, well, which I did sit down with him, right? And that was basically, I know there's a lot of political things going on and a lot of big, newsworthy events, but he is family. So the first question was, how are you? As far as the political stuff, like I just said, I mean, I did speak to him. I'm not going to go into great detail about the things that we did discuss because there is an expectation of privacy there. But I can say that his understanding of things may surprise people if they had the opportunity to engage with him any longer than the typical 5-minute news soundbite.
About the experience of serving in the Ukrainian army, Bakhmut, Kupiansk, Koshivka, Avdiivka, Vuhledar, you were particularly, as I understand, everywhere. There were instances when you helped people from various units, and you also traveled to Zaporizhia and worked on that front. Can you describe some of the most challenging experiences you faced during your time in Bakhmut and other key locations? What role did you play in assisting various units, and were there any particular instances where your help made a significant impact?
Okay, that was multiple questions. So the most challenging thing for me individually was the language barrier. Obviously I was in Ukraine long enough to probably learn the language, but I didn't, and that's my fault. I should have tried harder. But a lot of the units that I was around had guys that spoke English at least a little bit. So, and they like to kind of use me to learn and get better at their English. So that was so that limited kind of the role you can have if you're surrounded by people. In some really stressful situations, you can't expect people to communicate in their second language as well. So there is a thing, at least in the U.S. military, we call support by fire, and that's what I did in the U.S. military anyway. So that was a pretty good natural role for me to fall into. As far as making a significant difference, I mean, I think so. I hope so. I don't know. I would leave that determination up to the guys that were with me. I'll let them decide if I made a significant difference or not.
About language barrier, what words do you know in Ukrainian? Maybe you can tell us.
None that I would be willing to share with a young lady like yourself. I would not.
Okay.
If that explains it.
Okay, so what do you believe are the key strengths of the Ukrainian military that have contributed to its resilience and effectiveness in the face of Russian aggression?
I think the key thing is just the I don't want to say eagerness, because that's not, nobody's really eager to get in a fight, but I think that the Ukrainian soldiers have a sense that, this is an existential fight for them. And as bad as it is, and as much as everybody would much rather just go home, right? I mean, nobody wants to be living in a trench, in the mud and fighting constantly. But they understand that if they don't, kind of do their duty, that the alternative is worse. And that kind of morale and motivation it's an intangible thing, but it can't be overstated how important it is. So yeah, I think that the general attitude of the average Ukrainian soldier is probably the biggest strength.
How do you assess the state of Ukrainians' military morale and readiness, and are there specific areas where soldier welfare or support systems could be enhanced?
Well, as far as things being improved upon, like number one, I think that the general morale and welfare, obviously, I think Ukraine's doing a better job than their opponent. But as far as saying, can it be improved upon? Well, absolutely. And that's not necessarily an insult to Ukraine. It's just that it's never good enough, right? If you're fighting a conflict and you have casualties, there's room for improvement. And, for the sake of those guys that are still in the trenches, your command structures at the top should never be comfortable with the current situation. They should always be thinking, how can I improve upon this? And there are ways that I don't necessarily feel comfortable with discussing in front of a camera. But there are ways to improve, communication, the areas of communication, how information gets from the guys in the field up to higher command, the kind of, the willingness to share bad news with your commanders. I mean, sometimes, there are reasons why things go poorly. And if the commanders don't understand the real reasons for that, then they're going to make bad decisions based on the information they get. So, and then obviously, equipment, that's a difficult one to fix, but making sure everybody's equipped kind of consistently throughout brigades and battalions and things like that I understand the difficulty there. None of these problems are easy to solve, but they must just be continuously worked on and improved upon. So, yeah, I mean, I do think there's areas to improve.
Can you tell how does service in the U.S. Marine Corps differ from service in the Ukrainian Armed Forces in terms of training and organization? What are the key differences in tactical approaches and combat methods between U.S. military units and Ukrainian ones?
So, well, obviously I think the three largest air forces on the planet, or the two largest air forces on Earth, is number one is the United States Air Force, and number two is the United States Navy. So air power changes everything. So obviously tactics are going to change based on the fact that you can deliver like precision ordnance pretty much anywhere on the planet at will. That's something the Ukrainian army is not going to have anytime in the near future. So that limits things. But really focusing on tactics themselves is kind of silly, right? Like our tactics are going to be a certain way because we have access to certain assets that Ukraine's not going to have. And I think the biggest difference that could be translated is communication. And when I say communication, I don't just mean the use of radios. I mean the structure in which you transmit information from one person to another, and the way that you communicate the objectives on a mission, I think is much more robust in the United States military. And, you have to give Ukraine credit. They do really well with what they have. And you have to also consider that Ukraine went from a very small military to a very large military in a very short period of time while they were in a fight. So some of these things it's amazing that they've done as well as they have, given the circumstances.
European and NATO officials emphasize that the strong Ukrainian military backed by European security guarantees remains the most effective deterrent against future Russian aggression to ensure long-term peace in Ukraine and Europe. And NATO's General Secretary Mark Rutte gave an interview to Ukrainian outlet New Voice and stated that the first level of security guarantees for Ukraine should be the Ukrainian military, which Rutte stated is the first line of defense in deterrence. How do you assess the current state of the Ukrainian military's readiness to serve as the primary line of defense against Russian aggression, and what areas need further strengthening, in your opinion?
I think, well, he's absolutely correct. I mean, there is no true security guarantee from anyone outside of Ukraine. All of those guarantees are essentially, just pieces of paper. So Ukraine is ultimately responsible, as the beginning and end of their own security. As far as the military, I mean, obviously it's really hard to kind of improve things while you're currently in a fight. There's obviously a lot of stress being placed on it, on the military. One of the things that, I hear constantly, Western media saying is that Ukraine has a manpower issue, and Ukraine itself, the nation, does not have a shortage of people. The Ukrainian army has a shortage of infantrymen, and I think that there is a recruiting problem. And that recruiting problem is sometimes based on, part of the communication issues I spoke about earlier. I think, if guys go on operations and those operations don't go well, and it seems like the command structure is kind of disconnected with the guys that are on the ground actually doing the fighting, and then missions happen that go poorly, the guys that survive those poorly executed missions, they talk to their friends back home. And they tell them, hey, this, maybe this doesn't make sense. And things may seem disorganized. So I think fixing that communication problem and then figuring out a way to give Ukrainian infantrymen enough training before they engage the enemy. I know that's very difficult to do. It's much easier to say it in front of a camera than it is to do it. But just for example, we wouldn't even be allowed to go to a combat unit until just our basic minimum training was at least 6 months long. And then prior to deploying, it would be another 6-month training evolution. So if you think about it, for the average Marine, they have a year of training before they would ever be placed in front of the enemy. Now, I understand that the Ukrainian situation is not the same. They may not have the luxury of doing a full year, but you need to be able to train those guys up as best as you possibly can and equip them. And that receiving that training will solve a lot of your recruiting issues right off the bat. Like those guys that receive that good training will, instead of saying this doesn't make sense, will call their buddies and say, man, I've really learned a lot.
Also, journalists, wondered what exactly the alliance's participation might look like if peacekeepers were sent to Ukraine. According to Mark Rutte, this is a difficult issue at the moment because it will probably not involve NATO as such. It's unlikely, but it could be NATO allies that would be involved. That always means that it would affect NATO territory. It could also have implications for the defense of NATO territory in the future. In your opinion, what challenges do you foresee in deploying peacekeepers to Ukraine, particularly in terms of coordination among international actors and ensuring the safety of peacekeeping forces?
And I really don't know what the kind of peacekeeper thing would look like. I mean, if you look at the size of this conflict, I do think it's relatively insignificant if, if they say we're going to send 5,000 peacekeepers, well, if you look at the size of this conflict, that's really kind of irrelevant. And somebody like Russia, who's already sacrificed, 1 million casualties in their effort to kind of take over Ukraine, looking at 5,000 Western troops is not going to serve as a deterrent to them. So I think that's the difficulty. And but in some ways, I think what Western European nations could do that could help, instead of, Ukraine has a lot of troops tied up in the West and like along the northern border with Belarus and things like that. And freeing up those guys so Ukrainian soldiers can really handle the brunt of the deterrent. The deterrent option would go further than like putting Western European troops on the front. The problem is right now it's just words. I haven't seen any like concrete actions being taken to actually send Western European soldiers into Ukraine at any kind of a large scale. So at this point, I think it's kind of irrelevant. It's almost where I'll believe it when I see it, kind of thing.
Also about your emotions, because you mentioned that you miss Ukraine. What aspects of life in Ukraine do you miss the most?
This is going to sound really strange, but it's, like being a soldier is a really simple life, right? You have one problem and it's the same problem everybody else has, which is, there's the bad guys. What are you going to do about them? So then, you come back home to the United States and you got to deal with all kinds of complex problems. But as far as Ukraine itself, the people were always very, very gracious to me. I miss the fact that at almost every town I went to in Ukraine, there was always like I know dogs, like stray dogs in almost every town in Eastern Ukraine. That's how I remember which village I was in, because somebody would be like, remember the black and white dog? And I'm like, yeah, I remember that. So, and coffee. Like, I know it sounds really silly, but your coffee is much better than ours in the US.
Coffee. Maybe can you share more any memorable moments or connections you made during your time in Ukraine that you still reflect on? Coffee, maybe something else.
No, I mean, there's nothing specific, but you make friends. I have friends now that are over there, and now it's very difficult to be able to kind of interact with them in any kind of meaningful way, which is unfortunate. And then the other aspect of it is, when you put so much time and effort into something and you leave, I mean, I had to leave, right? It was a security thing. It would be really inappropriate for me to be in Ukraine, given my cousin's position. But yeah, you feel like you left something unfinished. And that's the difficult part to kind of wrestle with, is the fact that I feel like I didn't accomplish the things I wanted to accomplish, which is see it through to the end. But in lieu of participating over there, kind of trying to illustrate the things I think that could improve the situation for the guys in the trenches is the best way I know to contribute at this point.
And what do you think is most important for the international community to understand about Ukraine and its people based on your experiences there?
Well, for me, particularly for the U.S., I think, when I have interacted with Ukrainians, they remind me a lot of like conservative Americans, right? Like, very family value oriented, right? They're very much family oriented. And the most important one is like for Americans, even if you are kind of soured on the issue of Ukraine in general, or you just have kind of, you don't really understand the importance of supporting Ukraine. It's to realize that Russia is the impediment to peace in this conflict. I mean, you can start to see where the administration is starting to realize that now, and I think they realized it all along. But it's still prudent for them to kind of provide an off ramp to peace with at least provide the option of it. And if the Russians don't take that off ramp, then we'll reassess how to deal with it. But the main thing is that Russia is not a friend to the United States or Western Europe, and they view us as an enemy. Whether that's correct or not it's kind of irrelevant. That's how they view us. So they're going to treat us like an enemy, no matter what. And allowing them to kind of succeed here will encourage them to do more.
And a little bit about Frontline, because now I see that the Institute for the Study of War has stated that the pace of the Russian offensive in Ukraine is steadily decreasing. Russian forces advanced by only 143 square kilometers in March 2025, the lowest figure in the past 5 months. What are the key strategic goals of the Russian military now, and what are the main challenges currently facing the Russian military in its operations? Also, your opinion.
Yeah, I mean, this is certainly going to be opinion-based. I have no idea what the strategic goals of the Russian army is, right? It's sometimes very confusing. Some of their actions are very confusing and kind of defy military logic to me. I mean, I think I don't know. I honestly couldn't tell you what their long-term plan is. I think initially it was pretty obvious, but I think now they're kind of reacting to the fact that their plans aren't working. So I think their objectives kind of change over time. And I think there's different factions within Russia that some want to continue the war, some don't. Some want to be like more pro-Western, and some just really hate the West. So I think there's different factions, and they're kind of competing with each other for what their goals are. As far as the ISW saying that the pace has slowed, I mean, I know Putin just announced another mobilization. And one thing I've kind of noticed with the Russians throughout this conflict is they kind of seem to like build up supplies and then launch in like big, launch assaults and big surges. And then they'll kind of expend all the supplies that they built up for that, assault operation, and then they'll regroup. And I think that's what you're seeing right now is they, pushed really hard towards Pokrovsk. They consumed a lot of resources doing that and consumed a lot of resources combating the Ukrainians in Kursk. And now they're kind of at a resupply period where it'll maybe be a little quieter for the next few months. And then, but unfortunately, if they do mobilize those people and build up supplies, they'll probably try again.
Mr. Vance, I thank you for this conversation. Thank you a lot for supporting Ukraine, for your service. I need to say that JD Vance's brother was with us today, Nate Vance. Guys, subscribe on our channel, comment this video, and see you soon. Mr. Vance, thank you again.
All right, thank you.
And see you.
Okay, bye.
Bye.